A collection of ghost stories. Volume 1. A novel by Neil Wesson. Chapter 16. The Beachcomber. The cold sea mist blew over the rippled wet sand of Flamber Beach. The strip of sandy beach was enclosed between the crashing sea and the sheer cliffs of Flamber Head. The cliffs were riddled with a network of caves naturally formed by the sea over the last 100,000 years. Only one path led down to the beach, and it was wise not to stray too far from it. The sea could easily and quickly cut any inexperienced person off from the only safe escape route. Many souls over the years had perished in this way. The cave system, so it was said by locals, were haunted by the ghosts of pirates trapped and washed out too by the sea. A soul figure walked alone the beach that cold morning, on his head a pair of headphones, in his hand a metal detector. John Smith came to the beach most days. For years the stories had been told of long-lost treasure washed up on this part of the coast. He wanted to be rich, but he wasn't the sort of man who particularly wanted to work and earn his money. Each time the electronic beep sounded, his trowel would furiously dig up the sand. The usual results would be no more than a piece of twisted old metal, rusted off of a boat or packing crate. The occasional coin would manifest itself, but never anything more. After one such disappointing find, he sighed and looked around. To his right the sea crashed down on the sand, and to his left the cliffs rose up into the overcast sky. He was cold and had had enough for today. If John Smith had have stood on that very spot almost exactly 250 years previous, a magnificent sight would have met his eyes. A three-masted sailing ship hugged the coastline, sailing south along the east coast. The sails were taken in as it prepared to drop anchor off the Flamber coast. Its illegal cargo was being ready to be transported ashore and hidden in one of the many caves which served as a bolt hole for the privateers. The assembled bags and chest of coins were safely secured into the rowing boat when the lookout's voice bellowed, "Gunship astern." The crew that remained aboard jumped into action. The cannon were maneuvered to the correct angle and pitch, but as the master-at-arms drew in a breath to shout fire, the Royal Naval gunship let off a salvo at the pirates. The naval gunners knew their trade well. Several balls found their mark. "Return fire," bellowed Captain Jonathan Price. He stood on the poop deck at the rear of the vessel looking down on his crew, a crew of thieves and cutthroats. They were not organized, not sailors. Eventually 4 cannon fired, their shots well off mark. Another salvo came in from the damned navy. The mizzenmast took a direct hit. But the creak and groan, the upper half of it broke off, just above the mainsail. "Look out, Captain," shouted a voice as a screaming man fell off of the falling jib into the sea. Price looked skyward to see the mast falling toward him. Quickly he jumped out of the way, but not quick enough. The mast caught his leg, pinning him down on the deck. He was in agony, the lower half of his right leg had shattered. Just before he passed out he could see a small rowing boat making for the shore. "Go on, lads." He tried to speak, but couldn't. As his eyes closed, the small rowing boat took a direct hit, blowing it out of the water. "I swear no one will have it." John took off his headset and made for the cliff path. Time to go home. A shrill screech emanated from his headset, stopped him dead in his tracks. It was fortunate that he wasn't wearing the equipment, the noise would have probably deafened him. The metal detector must have picked something up. Judging by the intensity of the tone, it was something big. He moved the metal detector over the area, as he thought it was big. With his trowel furiously he dug. The metal blade of the tool hit something hard. Scraping the sand off the surface, he could see wooden planks bonded together and, yes, straps of riveted brass holding them in place. Such was his concentration on the discovery of the chest, he failed to see a figure way off down the beach watching him. The silhouetted figure stood as steady as a rock. How he kept such a good balance was a mystery, as the lower half of his right leg appeared to be missing. Agony ripped through Price's leg as he regained consciousness. He opened his eyes to see unfamiliar surroundings. He was in a room, but alive. Stabs of pain shot up from the lower part of his right leg. Instinctively he tried to sit up from his laying position and grab that part of his anatomy to offer it some kind of comfort. He couldn't sit up. He was tied down to the bed on which he lay, restrained like a wild animal. The only part of his body he could move was his head, that at least was not restrained. Looking down his body he could see the source of the pain. The lower half of his right leg was missing, amputated just below the knee joint. Around the stump of the leg was wound a white bandage, most of it colored red where his own blood had stained it. Where was he and what had happened to his ship and crew? Most important of all, what had happened to the chest of gold coins? Where was that? By the door of the small room stood a red-jacketed army private, standing at ease, on guard. He couldn't be guarding against an escape attempt from Price. Even if he could liberate himself from his bonds and overpower the guard, how would he walk out with half a leg missing? He must be there then to stop anyone from entering. Was his crew going to mount a rescue attempt? Were his crew at liberty? Were they alive? A knock came from the door. The guard turned and looked through the observation hole. A sentry saluted a sharp recognition as an officer entered and positioned himself at the end of the bed. "There's a crowd outside, Price, shouting for your release." We are popular, aren't we? They are calling you the new Robin Hood. Why don't you listen to them and do as they bid?" Price said through gritted teeth. The pain was so great he could hardly speak. The officer smiled at him, "Because you're nothing but a common criminal and you're going to hang." The following morning John Smith took the 8A bus into the town. Hornsea was a small seaside town on the Yorkshire coast, modest in many ways. Its beach, amusements and town centre all small and rather understated. Getting off the bus in the main street that ran through the town, John found the shop he was looking for. The doorway was not one he had passed through before. The neighboring betting offices and fish and chip shops were more his normal haunts. The owner of the antique shop watched him enter. Immediately the small bow-tied proprietor eyed him with suspicion. The scruffy unshaven man was not his normal clientele, and as he entered the aroma of stale beer and cigarettes accompanied him. "Can I help you?" asked the shop owner. If this unwanted visitor must come into the shop, he wanted him where he could be seen at all times. "Yes," said John, unsure of himself, "I need your help." From his pocket he took out a white handkerchief. Placing it on the glass-topped counter slowly he began to unfold it. The shopkeeper watched his large thick fingers unfolding the piece of cloth, ground in dirt, highlighted the cracks and cuts in his hands, while his fingernails were black with ingrained dirt. His opinion of the visitor suddenly changed. As the last fold of white linen was taken off he saw the sparkle of gold. A golden coin. He was no expert on coins, but he took a close look at the disc with his magnifying glass. His heart started to race and his breath started to falter. "My God. Is it worth anything?" John asked. It must be to have evoked such a reaction from this little man behind the counter. "Where did you get it?" Suspicion had entered his head. Had he stolen it? He had heard no reports of a coin robbery. News such as that soon got around the antiques world. If any stolen gods came onto the market, the thieves could easily be traced. "I found on the beach." He didn't mention his metal detector. The law was complicated when it came to such things, best not to say. The shop owner picked up the coin and took a closer look. As he did so he shivered with excitement. Out of the corner of his eye he caught sight of someone looking into the shop window. When he turned to look, the figure was not looking into the shop but was on the other side of the street. It was difficult to make out who it was. The sun was behind him silhouetting the onlooker. "Well?" asked John, excitement in his voice. "If this is what I think it is, it could be worth anything up to £5,000. Do you have any more?" John couldn't speak. Shock had paralyzed his motor functions. He heard himself utter the words, 1 or 2. In fact, it was probably more like 1 or 2,000. He left the shop not knowing what to do. After walking 3 doors down the road he entered another establishment, one that he frequented on a regular basis, the Dog and Duck. A crowd had gathered outside York Assizes for the announcement of the verdict on the People's Champion. A quiet hum of anticipation circled around the crowd. Inside the halls of Justice Jonathan Price stood accused in the dock, a crotch under his right arm supported his right-hand side. The list of charges were long and numerous, most of them were at least based on fact, but several were an invention of the Crown or committed by other parties. He of course denied all charges. What else could he do? The verdict of the Justice Thomas was never in question. Before the trial began all knew of his guilt. When his lordship donned the black cap no one gasped in surprise, least of all Price himself. The sentence was also another foregone conclusion, to be hung from the neck until dead. The prisoner was taken away. A hardly recognizable John Smith stood at the back of Sotheby's auction house, London. It was the first time in his life he had worn a suit. His clean-shaven and tidy appearance was now going to be the norm. His treasure trove had an estimated value of £1.5 million, and the bidding was fast approaching that mark. The room was full, standing room only. Whether the assembled masses were bidding or just onlookers John couldn't tell. The event had even attracted media interest. The crew from the BBC News were present to record the proceedings. The bidding passed its estimated price and raced onto the £2 million mark, then one of the bidders dropped out. £2 million was a fair price, he was happy with that. Then as the auctioneer called, going, twice a nod came from one of the line of men cradling telephones next to their ears. The bidding was going again. The £3 million mark was passed, then 4, 5, 6. Eventually the bidding stopped at £6.5 million. Jubilantly John strode up the center aisle of the auction room to everyone's applause. At the front he shook hands with the auctioneer, thanking him wholeheartedly for handling the sale. As he turned to take the applause and leave the sale room he saw framed in the double doors at the rear of the room, a silhouetted black figure, the bottom half of his right leg missing. The sight made him stop and think for a moment, where had he seen him before? He smiled at the bidders in the room, looking around at their happy faces, then turning back to the door. Whoever it was had now gone. The doorway was empty. The Nosmire was a large expanse of open land on the outskirts of York. From first light the crowds had started to gather. The center point to the gathering was a large old oak tree. Over the many hundreds of years it had stood there, it must have seen many events in its lifetime, but none as gruesome as its latest purpose. An open-topped cart trundled across the land pulled by a single horse. Standing in the back, hands tied together, was the figure of Jonathan Pryce. He saw the crowd waiting his presence, waiting for the show to begin. Under the tree was erected a temporary platform, 2 steps leading up to it. The cart came to a rest alongside of it. As it drew up, a rope was thrown around one of the large thick branches of the tree. Pryce was led up onto the temporary gallows. Defiantly he smiled at the crowd who cheered his name. At least he was dying a hero and would not disappoint. The noose was put around his neck, then it was all over. His body fell. The neck snapped. Jonathan Pryce, pirate, thief, hero, was dead. Over the last few days, John Smith had been in the company of a team of documentary makers. The program being filmed was part of a series on treasure seekers. The first program was about the biggest treasure haul ever made in this country. Several locations had been visited during the filming, and now on the final day the crew had arrived in York. A mock-up of the hanging of Jonathan Pryce was scheduled to be the final piece of filming. The gallows were erected before the camera, sound and makeup crews arrived at the location. The director sat in his chair and took a look at the monitors showing each camera picture. The first shot was of the actor playing Pryce dismounting the cart. The second and final shot was of the hanging body. "Where's the body?" someone shouted. A flurry of activity ensued. The cameramen lined up the shot as the director made several points of fine-tuning. "What's that?" he bellowed. On the monitor he could see the black outline of a man standing away in the distance directly behind the shot, a one-legged man. The director stood up looking over the bank of TV screens. "You there, bugger off," he shouted over the field. 1 or 2 of the crew turned to see who he was shouting at. No one was around, not to be seen in any case. The director felt somewhat of a fool as he stared into space. He looked back at the monitor, the screen was blank. He sat back in his chair and picked up his plastic cup filled with hot coffee. A crew member had found the mannequin dummy of the famous pirate and was putting its head into the noose. "Right, let's get it up there then." The director was getting impatient. As someone pulled on the rope, the director watched the process on the monitor. "Hold it there," he ordered. The legs were framed on the screen, perfect. Then the figure was back. "What?" he yelled. "Who is that? They're ruining my shot." Again he jumped up out of his chair and drew in a large lung full of air, ready to bellow at the intruder. Then words never came out of his mouth. The figure was gone again. A shiver ran down the back of his neck. Was someone playing a joke on him? He looked at the legs hanging down from the tree. "For God's sake," he said out loud, "who was responsible for making the mannequin? Whoever it was would be getting a rocket up their backside." Jonathan Pryce had the right leg cut off at the knee. This dummy had 2 full legs. Slowly he looked up the torso of the hanging body. It swung slightly as it hung down from the branch, then he realized. The figure hanging down was not the mock-up body of Jonathan Pryce, but the face looking down on him was the agonizingly twisted face of John Smith. The end.